In 1928, the United States was the richest, basically the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. I mean, it had the economic gravity to shape the entire globe.
Right.
So what did it do? It slammed its doors completely shut. It hid behind this massive wall of tariffs and, just watched the global economy burn.
Yeah, the wild piece of history.
It really is. Like, why do superpowers sometimes act entirely against their own interests?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is Friday, August 7th, 2026. And whether you're prepping for some high-level meeting or you're just, insanely curious about how the hidden gears of the world actually turn, you are the third person in our conversation today.
And it is a question that really challenges a lot of our basic assumptions about the modern world order. It's totally at the heart of the research we're looking at today.
Exactly. So we are digging into this truly seminal 1976 paper by Stephen D. Krasner. It's called State Power and the Structure of International Trade.
A classic.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is to figure out why the global trade system is sometimes wide open, goods flowing everywhere, and other times it's slammed completely shut.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think most people often just assume that global trade naturally evolved, right?
Oh, for sure. That's the default assumption.
Like, we invented steamships, then we got cargo planes, then the internet. So obviously, trade just became more open over time as this, natural progression of human progress.
Right, that is the conventional wisdom. But Krasner's core thesis argues the exact opposite of that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the structure of international trade, it doesn't just organically evolve because we built better boats or faster communication. It is deliberately engineered.
Engineered by who?
By the states themselves. The global system is built by the specific interests and really the sheer power of nation states who are just actively trying to maximize their own goals.
So it's less about, like, Adam Smith's invisible hand guiding everyone to a free trading utopia and more about powerful states just throwing their weight around. Exactly.
Yeah.
But before we can understand how they build this global system, we really need to understand what individual states actually want. Like, what is the end goal when a government decides to open its borders or close them?
Right.
It all comes down to state survival. Krasner argues that every state is trying to balance four basic interests:
Okay, what are they?
aggregate national income, social stability, political power, and economic growth. But the key to the entire theory is that an open trade system impacts those four goals very differently depending on, well, how large and how economically developed a state actually is.
So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all outcome. Let's look at that first goal, national income.
Sure.
Because standard economics says free trade makes the pie bigger for everyone, right? But the sources show that the benefits are actually highly skewed.
Oh, massively skewed.
Yeah.
Small states get a much larger proportional boost to their national income from open trade than massive states do.
Why is that?
Well, small states just lack the internal resources.
Yes.
They don't have the domestic market size to produce everything they need efficiently on their own. So they rely on trade to survive.
Right. Whereas a giant state...
Yeah, a massive continent-spanning state like the U.S. or Russia, they're going to benefit financially from international trade, obviously.
Yeah.
But they don't strictly depend on it to keep the lights on in the same way,
Okay, so small states get richer from open borders. Sounds like a win. Is there a catch?
There is absolutely a catch, and it's the second goal: social stability. Openness is this incredibly double-edged sword here. When you open your borders, your domestic economy is suddenly exposed to the wild, unpredictable swings of the global market.
Right, because if you're suddenly competing with the whole world, your local industries can just be wiped out overnight.
Exactly. Let's say the global price of textiles suddenly plummets because some new technology is invented halfway across the world. Your local textile workers lose their jobs. They now have to completely shift to a new industry. That causes massive friction. And how well a state handles that friction depends entirely on its level of development.
I see. Because a highly developed state has a mobile, skilled workforce, right? If one sector declines, those workers can just be retrained and absorbed by, say, a rising tech or services sector.
Precisely. But if you're a less developed country, moving unskilled laborers or like peasant farmers into a completely new economic sector is going to be incredibly difficult. It causes massive social upheaval.
It makes me think of it like being out on the open water. A small developing state is essentially a tiny rowboat. Free trade gives it a massive speed boost that's the national income going up.
That's a great way to look at it. But because it is a rowboat, every single wave caused by those global market shifts, threatens to completely capsize it.
Right, that's the social instability.
Ex-
Meanwhile, a massive, highly developed state is more like an ocean liner. It gets a bit of a speed boost from the global currents, but those exact same waves, they barely even register on the deck.
The ocean liner has the internal ballast, right? The economic diversity to handle the turbulence without breaking apart.
That makes total sense. But here is where I kind of want to push back a bit, looking at the third goal, political power.
Okay, go ahead.
Doesn't relying on other countries for trade inherently make a state weak? I mean, if you're depending on global supply chains for your vital goods, aren't you completely at the mercy of the system?
This raises an important question, and it is arguably one of the most counterintuitive insights in the whole paper.
Hmm.
We tend to think of power as absolute independence.
Right, like self-sufficiency.
Yeah, but Krasner argues you have to look at political power through the lens of the opportunity cost of closure.
Opportunity cost of closure, meaning what? Like, if the entire global trade system suddenly shut down tomorrow, what is the cost? Who suffers the most?
Precisely that. The state that hurts the least holds the most power.
Oh, wow.
Large, highly developed states actually gain massive political power in an open system because their opportunity cost of closure is the lowest. If trade suddenly stops, that large state has a massive domestic market and an advanced, adaptable workforce to fall back on.
They'll survive the shock.
Exactly. They will survive it easily.
While the small state, the rowboat, would be absolutely devastated. I mean, they would starve.
Right. And because the large state can basically walk away from the negotiating table with far less pain, they hold all the political leverage. They can use the mere threat of closing the system to secure economic concessions.
Or even force non-economic political goals.
Exactly. The power isn't in being completely independent. The power is in being the one who can survive the breakup.
That is brilliant. But, the sources do point out one truly fascinating anomaly to this rule, like a specific type of country that totally breaks the mold.
Yes. The oil exporting states, like Saudi Arabia.
Right. According to the core theory, these states are relatively less developed in a broad economic sense, so an open system should make them incredibly vulnerable to instability.
But they hold a trump card.
Yeah. Because they sit on such massive reserves of a universally demanded resource, their opportunity cost of closure is practically zero.
Exactly. They do not need a highly mobile, diversified workforce to survive a trade shutdown. They can literally just turn off the tap.
Just shut off the oil.
Yeah. It's an exception that proves the rule about leverage. Which brings us to the final goal. States balance economic growth.
Okay.
For small states, openness clearly drives growth. But for large, developed states, it's a delicate dance. Openness helps them grow, but it also allows their advanced technology and capital to bleed out to potential rivals.
So they can only maintain their growth in an open system if they are constantly innovating. Like they have to be running faster than everyone else just to keep their technological edge. Okay, so we've established what individual states want. They're constantly juggling income, stability, leverage, and growth. But now we move from the individual level to the systemic level.
Big picture.
Right. What happens when you throw all these different states into the global sandbox together? Who actually gets to write the rules?
Well, it depends entirely on how power is distributed in that sandbox. Imagine a world composed of many small, highly developed states.
Okay.
That world will naturally form an open trading system. They all need the income. And because they are developed, they have the internal machinery to handle the social instability.
Makes sense.
But if you flip it and have a world with just a few massive, unequally developed states, you get a closed system.
Because the big, less developed states don't want the social instability, and they definitely don't want to be politically leveraged by the more advanced states. They just build walls and hide behind them.
Right. And that leads us to the start of the show. The ultimate engine of global free trade. The hegemonic system.
A hegemonic system.
Yes. This is a world where there is one single state that is vastly larger and significantly more technologically advanced than anyone else.
So what does this all mean? Wait, if a superpower is completely dominant, wouldn't they just want to build a giant fortress, hoard all their wealth, and crush the competition?
You'd think so?
Right. Like, why on earth would the biggest kid on the playground champion free trade and invite everyone else to play?
Because the hegemon is the ultimate ocean liner we talked about earlier. For them, an open system is entirely asymmetrical in its benefits.
How so?
Free trade boosts their already massive national income. It accelerates their economic growth because they can just flood the world with their advanced technology and exports. And most importantly, It maximizes their political leverage over every other nation.
So the hegemon wants an open world because an open world is a world they completely dominate.
Exactly.
But they can't just snap their fingers and magically make the world open, right? How do they actually convince everyone else to tear down their walls?
They do it using a combination of powerful, positive, and negative incentives. Basically, carrots and sticks.
Okay, what are the carrots?
For carrots, the hegemon offers access to its own massive domestic market. They're essentially saying, open your borders to my goods, and I will let you sell your goods to my very rich citizens.
That's a huge incentive.
It is. They also provide cheap, advanced exports that other countries need to develop. And crucially, they provide global monetary liquidity.
Which means what, exactly, in practice?
It means they provide the trusted currency and the credit that makes global trade physically possible. Without a stable reserve currency to price goods and settle debts, international trade just grinds to a halt. The hegemon acts as the global bank.
And the sticks. What happens to the countries that refuse the carrots?
Oh, the hegemon can withhold vital foreign grants. They can cut off access to that lucrative domestic market. Or they can engage in ruinous competition in third-party markets, literally intentionally driving weaker rivals out of business. Yeah. They have the sheer economic gravity to pull medium and small states into an open system, whether those states entirely want to be there or not.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because now we get to take this neat, logical theory that a rising hegemon creates an open world and actually test it against cold, hard historical data.
Yes, this is where Krasner's work gets really granular.
Exactly. To measure this, Krasner looks at 3 specific scorecards. First, tariff levels, the actual taxes governments place on imported goods. Second, trade proportions, which is a country's trade measured as a percentage of its total GDP.
A third metric is regional trading patterns, which is measured by something called the relative acceptance, or RA, indicator.
Okay, I'll be honest, when I was reading the sources, the RA indicator and its null hypothesis sounded incredibly dense. You might lose me here.
I get that. It is heavy academic jargon, but the concept is actually quite simple when you break it down.
Okay, break it down for me.
The RA indicator is just a way to track whether trade is truly global, or if it's trapped inside little regional bubbles. Imagine a hypothetical world where geography and politics just didn't exist.
Like a blank slate.
Right. If a country traded purely randomly, based only on the economic size of other nations, that is our baseline. That is the null hypothesis.
Ah, okay. So it's a mathematical baseline of what a perfectly open, completely frictionless world would look like.
Exactly. The RA indicator just measures how far reality deviates from that perfect baseline.
Gotcha.
So a number closer to 0 means trade is truly open and global. A higher number means a powerful state is heavily favoring specific countries, usually just treating within its own encapsulated regional empire.
Okay, that makes so much more sense. So lower tariffs, higher trade proportions, and an RA indicator near 0 means we have a beautifully open world. Let's look at the first great hegemon, the British Empire, from 1820 to 1879.
Right, the classic example.
The data paints a picture of absolute British dominance. I mean, they were the workshop of the world.
They really were. Around 1880, Britain's relative per capita income, their share of world trade, and their share of foreign investment reached levels that were completely unmatched. To give you an idea, they had roughly twice the share of world trade as their nearest competitor, which was France.
And they used that massive power to just rip open the global system. In 1846, Britain unilaterally repealed the Corn Laws.
A massive turning point.
Yeah, this was huge. The Corn Laws were these massive tariffs designed to protect wealthy British landowners from cheap foreign grain. By repealing them, Britain essentially sacrificed its own agricultural sector so it could import cheap food to feed its factory workers.
It was a massive signal that they were fully committing to industrial free trade.
And they didn't stop there. In 1860, they signed the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty with France. This wasn't just a bilateral agreement. It contained a most favored nation clause that sparked this amazing domino effect, practically eliminating trade barriers across the entirety of Europe.
And they used their military, too. They forced open markets in Latin America and India.
Right. Definitely not all peaceful.
No, not at all. And they provided that ultimate carrot we talk about, the financial backbone. The Bank of England and the City of London provided the short-term financing that made moving goods possible.
And the British pound, tied strictly to the gold standard, gave the world the confidence and the liquidity it needed to trade.
Exactly. Now, it is worth noting the hegemon's power is not infinite. The United States remained strictly protectionist during this entire 19th century era. Britain simply couldn't force the U.S. to play along.
Right, but overall, the theory holds up perfectly here. Rising British hegemony meant an opening global world.
It did.
Now, let's fast forward and contrast that with the second great hegemon, the United States, from 1945 to 1970. Following World War II, Europe was in ruins, and the U.S. was in an even more dominant position than Britain had ever been in.
They were vastly larger than anyone else. They held a massive share of world production. And, exactly as the theory predicts, the U.S. aggressively engineered an open global structure.
They championed the GETI, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This wasn't just a single treaty, it was a systemic framework that led to massive multilateral tariff reductions across the globe.
And they used their immense economic leverage to force Britain to dismantle its closed imperial preference system.
Just tearing down the old empires.
Exactly. And just like the Bank of England did in the 19th century, the U.S. provided the liquidity for the entire post-war world through the U.S. dollar, which was pegged to gold.
Right. They funded European reconstruction and provided the credit the system needed to function.
Sorry.
So if we look at the 19th century British Empire and the mid-20th century American Empire, the data perfectly matches the theory, right? A rising superpower creates an open world.
Well, that is where this paper takes a fascinating turn.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the data actually breaks the theory in three massive, glaring places.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the timeline is completely out of phase.
Where are the holes?
The first major break is between 1900 and 1913. During this period, Britain's relative economic power was clearly declining. They were rapidly losing their industrial and technological edge to the U.S. and Germany.
Okay, so according to the state power theory, a declining hegemon should start closing its borders to protect its vulnerable industries.
Right. But Britain didn't. Trade actually got more open globally during that period.
Okay, that's strange. What's the second hole?
The second hole is even more glaring. The period from 1919 to 1939, right after World War I. At this point, the United States was the undisputed top economic power in the world.
Undisputed.
Completely. To put it in perspective, economists measure this era using something called international units, which is just a standardized way to measure pure economic gravity back then. In 1928, the aggregate size of the U.S. economy was 82.3 billion international units.
Okay, and Britain?
Britain was at 22.5.
Wow, the U.S. was nearly 4 times larger than the former hegemon, so the U.S. should have immediately stepped up, opened the world, and provided the global liquidity, right?
They absolutely should have.
Yeah.
But they did the exact opposite. The U.S. chose strict isolationism.
Oh, right.
In 1930, they passed the disastrous Smoot-Hawley tariff, which slapped massive taxes on imported goods and triggered a retaliatory global trade war. In 1933, they went off the gold standard. They refused to act as the global lender of last resort.
And they essentially watched as the international monetary system completely collapsed into the Great Depression.
Exactly. It completely breaks the theory.
And the third hole?
From the 1960s onward, U.S. relative dominance began to decline compared to a rising, rebuilt Europe and a booming Japan. Their share of global GDP shrank.
But again, trade didn't close up, as the theory suggests it should. It stayed remarkably open.
Exactly.
So the theory has these massive blind spots. Why on earth did Britain stay open as it fell, and why did the United States stay closed as it rose?
This is where Krasner amends his own state power theory with a vital twist: domestic politics.
Yeah.
You see, states do not change their grand economic strategies like flipping a light switch just because the real-time GDP data changes.
Right.
State policies are deeply, deeply sticky.
Sticky. It's like living in a house with a terrible floor plan.
Oh, I like that.
You know it's inefficient, you know it takes you 10 minutes to walk from the bedroom to the kitchen, you know you should remodel, but you don't actually knock down the walls and rebuild until a massive oak tree falls through the roof and literally forces you to start over.
That is a very apt analogy. In political economy, it requires a massive cataclysmic external event to force a state to change its foundational policies.
Right, the tree falling through the roof?
Exactly. The 1840s potato famine was the cataclysm that finally forced Britain to repeal the Corn Laws. The Great Depression and World War II were the trees falling through the roof that finally forced the U.S. to abandon its isolationism.
And until those cataclysms happen, states are just trapped by their own history. Krasner brings in this brilliant quote from the political scientist E.E. Schachtschneider: "New policies create new politics."
Yes, this is known as the lock-in effect. When a state makes a major policy choice, it empowers specific domestic groups that benefit from that choice. Those groups get wealthy, they get influential, and they then use their new power to make sure the policy never changes, even if it eventually ruins the rest of the country.
Let's look at Britain as the perfect example. When they chose free trade in the 1840s, it made the financial institutions in the City of London incredibly rich and powerful. They were the ones financing all this new global trade.
Right.
By 1900, Britain's actual manufacturing edge was dying. The factories were struggling. The country probably needed to raise tariffs to protect its domestic industries.
But they couldn't. The London bankers were so deeply entrenched in the political machinery that they forced the government to maintain free trade and stay on the gold standard.
Wow.
They prioritized their international investments over the domestic economy, to the absolute ruin of British farmers and factory workers. The British state was basically a prisoner to the domestic financial monster it had created 50 years earlier.
So basically, it's the 19th century equivalent of Wall Street lobbying today, forcing the government to act against the interests of Main Street. And we see the exact same lock-in effect in the U.S., just in the opposite direction. I mean, why was the U.S. so stubbornly isolationist in the 1920s when it was clearly a superpower?
Because of how their domestic politics were structured. Pre-1930s, U.S. tariff decisions were made in congressional committees.
And congressional committees are notoriously susceptible to local special interests. The mechanics of it are fascinating. It's a process called log rolling.
Right. If you were a senator from a state that made shoes, you demanded a high tariff on imported shoes to protect your local factories.
And the senator from a state that grew wheat demanded a high tariff on imported wheat.
And they all just traded votes. You vote for my shoe tariff, I'll vote for your wheat tariff.
Yeah, they log-rolled each other until you got the Smoot-Hawley Act, which put massive economy-choking tariffs on virtually everything.
Yep. The domestic special interests were simply too strong. It literally took the cataclysm of the Great Depression to rip that power away from Congress.
Right, because following the Depression, trade authority was largely shifted to the presidency. The executive branch is insulated enough from those hyper-local special interests that it could finally look at the aggregate national interest.
Exactly. Only then could the U.S. push for global free trade. The institutional machinery had to be completely rewired by a disaster before the U.S. could finally act like the hegemon it already was.
So bringing this all together for you, the listener, we've gone on quite a journey today. We've seen how states aren't just altruistic trading partners. They are constantly, ruthlessly balancing their national income, social stability, and political power.
Absolutely.
We've seen how dominant hegemons like 19th century Britain and 20th century America build open global systems using massive economic carrots and sticks to benefit themselves. And most surprisingly, we've seen how historical cataclysms and sticky domestic political structures can trap nations in policies long past their expiration date. New policies create new politics.
Which leads us with a profound question about the world today. If Krasner is right, and past policy choices empower new domestic titans, we have to look at what American free trade policy since 1950 has actually birthed the modern massive multinational corporation.
Whoa.
These entities, built on global supply chains, are richer and more globally integrated than many sovereign nations.
That's true.
So the question is, what happens next? Even if a future economic cataclysm demands that the global system fundamentally change again, are today's multinational corporations now so deeply entrenched in the political machinery that they will restrict the state's ability to act?
Right.
Will big tech and global finance lock in the American state tomorrow exactly the same way the City of London locked in the British state a century ago?
That is a staggering thought to leave on. The ghost of the British Empire serving as a warning to the modern global economy. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. It's been an incredible conversation, and I hope it leaves you looking at the news and the true power of the state today in a completely different light.